I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
Iam europeană.
Európai polgár vagyok.
Eu sou europeia.
Jag är en medborgare i Europa.
Ja sam europeanka.
Yo soy ciudadana del continente europeo.
Jestem Europejczykiem.
Sunt europeană. Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja graștancă Europei.
Ja româneancă Europei. Sunt europeană.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.
Hello everyone, this is European Citizen Radio, Voices Beyond Brussels, brought to you by the European Democracy Lab, a podcast for, by and with European citizens and citizens of the world. My name is Ole Döring. I'm a philosopher and sinologist from Germany, building cultural bridges between Europe and China. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Aline Tedeschi. She is a global citizen from Brazil. She began her academic career studying in Sao Paulo in 2009, went to Argentina in 2013, then to China, Wuhan, in 2010, with the first university group that, I think you mentioned that in our talk earlier, with the first university group supported by the Confucius Institute of Brazil. And then you have been living in China since 2016. One of the remarkable things I find is that Dr. Tedeschi is not only a colleague of mine, a professor at the Hunan Normal University here in Changsha, which is in Hunan province in China. She's here teaching Portuguese language and cross-cultural communication. But moreover, she joins the first Brazil-China think tank in 2020, the name of which can be translated either as Observa China or as China Watch, a network, a think tank that is focusing on China, obviously. And we meet here in Changsha on the West Bank, the new business district of Changsha, of this southern Chinese metropolis, a city of 10 million people. Dr. Tedeschi, would you please introduce, beyond what I've been doing in a very sketchy way now, your academic journey that brought you to southern China?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello all to the audience. Well, my academic, let's say, career, it begins in 2008 on my undergraduate level in Brazil, which was in international relations. And in 2009, it was the year when it was announced that China just became Brazil's strategic partner, or the most important trade partner for our country. And so universities started on building up the idea that we should understand better, since obviously it would make a difference for this decade. Along with that, it was, the second term of Lulas' presidency, where he also would have this presidential diplomacy. And so foreign studies and foreign issues were more into our mainstream media as well. And so in 2009, it was opened the first Confucius Institute at the university where I was doing undergraduate level. And I started to engage in study groups about the BRICS, at that time still without South Africa or the BRIC, doing projections or scenario prospection and trying to figure out things, the first years of undergraduate level. What would be the future of studies, Brazil, China, and Brazil within BRICS countries? And so 2010, I had the opportunity to come to China, in Wuhan. Coincidentally or not, the university that I started to teach in 2016, to engage more in historical background of China and economics and cultural issues. It was very intense. We didn't have one day of rest during this 1 month in China, in Wuhan. But it is when it first came to me one sparkle of, well, maybe that's possible to come to China and to study even master degree or PhD, which did not happen. I came back to Brazil. At that time, it was not so welcoming, let's say, the environment for foreigners. It was a much more difficult bureaucratic process to come to Wuhan. And so I finished my undergraduate level all my research is sponsored by the FAPESP, which is the São Paulo most important sponsorship institution, and develop all my studies trying to analyze the most fundamental points of the strategic partnership between Brazil and China, until I had to change it on my PhD and make it more amplify or more comprehensive studies, since in 2016, I had to come to China.
That sounds like a fascinating, very rational description of your personal experience. You mentioned all the technical issues, the policy issues that were in the background of your going to China. But how about the culture shock at that time? I mean, people might be frightened to go there and even maybe have frightening experiences down on the ground when you are living there. What happened to you in this regard?
I often analyze that in two levels. I mean, a very personal level, which moves my interest. I was firstly interested on Asian culture, mostly by India. And so reading about the Bodhisattva and all these philosophical environment through India, and also later extend that to the readings of Buddhism, and then I get to China and Taoism. So there is this personal level in terms of intellectual interest, if we may say so. There's also a personal level of this particular moment in still 2015, where I had just moved from my master level. In the qualification of my dissertation, they passed me directly to a PhD level. And so I was feeling quite confused about what exactly I would study, because I had the opportunity to go to China, but almost by invitation, even though I passed through a selection process. But still, there are not too many people that would come to China from Brazil in 2016. And at this particular moment in Brazil, we had a drop in terms of sponsorships of research from the same institution I was receiving my sponsorship. And so they cut it out. And so I had this limbo moment of I could not teach in universities because I didn't conclude my master degree. And I had to continue my studies because I wasn't in a PhD. And so I had this particular personal level of, well, that's a huge opportunity for me to develop even more my research and working. And that's actually become the challenge, because I had to conclude my PhD and analysis and studying while I had this adaptation to not only living in a new country. I mean, China is obviously much more different than when I had to live in Argentina, as you can imagine, as South American. So in terms of culture, in terms of engaging into friendship networking, and also getting adapt to the educational system, which is consistently different from what I see in Brazil, it was at the same time motivating and it was a big challenge.
So you like this challenge and you never felt really uncomfortable?
I felt uncomfortable in very particular moments where I didn't know who to ask for help, or I was seeing and realizing that I was misunderstanding certain process, a bureaucratic process or an interpersonal process. So I had this challenge, and I didn't have my network at that time to ask this sort of doubts, and I felt that I was invading a certain space, or maybe being rude if I asked my peers, my Chinese peers at the university at that time.
Okay, so this is about your coming to China. Now, our European listeners will be interested in, especially when they hear your name, right? Mm-hmm. They will be interested in your relations to Europe. Do you have any relations? I mean, you are born in Brazil, and you have spent much of your life here in China and in other countries like Argentina. So is there any first-hand or second-hand relation to Europe, or maybe just as a citizen of the world, as a cultural entity? How do you feel about Europe?
That's a point that is known in Brazil, even through soccer teams, for example. There's one specific soccer team, this Palmeiras, that the whole tradition is linked to Italy. And so my surname, it is Tedeschi, it is Italian origin, and Tedesco would mean German in Italian. And so it was a background that I never got much in touch with, although members of my family, they hold Italian citizenship. So maybe in the future, I would think about having this connection. It's not so immediate for me.
But it's just rather an abstract notion for you.
Still is an abstract notion for me. I mean, I know the historical background in Brazil. My grandparents were Italian. And they came to Brazil. I listen mostly these stories and how they actually hold restaurants with Italian background food, which is called Universal Tedeschi Restaurant. Is still there in Brazil, a very tiny countryside city. I listen all these stories and how they managed, how they would talk with my mom's side, my mom's family. But it's not something concrete that I wanna now at this particular moment of my life do citizenship.
So you obviously chose to come to China instead to come to Europe, obviously. Now, I mentioned that you're working in that think tank now. So you just recently had this very, very important situation, this important maybe challenge even to help to organize the coverage of Lula's visit to China. Can you use this as a reference or as a door to introduce some of the work of your think tank?
Absolutely. China Watch, or Observa China in Portuguese, in Chinese, 广中国, it is one of the first network that was born online within the context of pandemic. It was obviously students and professionals who had experience here in China, and they felt this necessity of taking knowledge from China and the experience beyond only studies and readings and all the stereotypes that surrounds China in Brazil. And I had opportunity to join them by invitation because before I was taking part on another initiative. It was more journalistic side called 书面. Also with a very similar intention of translating even some news about China into Portuguese for Brazilian audience mostly. We didn't have that. All we had, it was mainstream media, which is pretty much informed by North American media. And so it was lacking this cultural background to inform China. And Observa China came into this moment where people from different parts of the world could come together, Brazilians, expats, could come together and make something out of this experience they had in China that was so difficult to translate to Brazilian audience. And the most difficult barrier being first, obviously, language, right? And second one, the stereotypes we had from China and all Chinese products is still very set up on the mindset of Brazilians that everything or all products connect to China are not good products. And so they are quite late into understanding China's and China's process, China's development, and the whole even political thought surrounding development in China. So Observa China came into this momentum where we could develop our research and develop a think tank, sorry for the terms, but in parallel. I mean, there's not much the concrete prospection in Brazil that researchers can actually work in a think tank. Either they go, obviously, being professors, or they go to the private area, or they go to inform by consulting companies the public policies. And so working on a think tank in Brazil is also something that we are developing, along with the idea of knowing more about China. And so the coming of our president to China in the beginning of this year, it was quite relevant to highlight the think tank as source of information of any sort, cultural, economic, political, and to engage on a network where people could actually exchange ideas about it. And that's something quite new in Brazil.
Just before you get to Lula's visit, for clarification, you are an independent think tank, right? I mean, when we talk about think tanks, these entities are not standardized in the way they are set up. In Germany, for example, we have some that are very close to the German Marshall Fund, or others are close to governments. So there are sometimes agendas behind them that are not strictly scientific or academic or, well, independent. So just for clarification.
It is one independent. Is it now as a non-profit organization in Brazil? So is it independent? We don't actually have by now one specific a setup of funding. We are in search for that. So we're establishing inside how it is the structure of the organization and the team that we need to build up so we can grow and even engage with structuring membership.
So then at the occasion of Lula's visit, you got into the limelight in a way, or you organized being in the limelight in order to talk about Lula's visit. So is there any specific impact of this visit that, in your coverage, but also for the relationship, not only between Brazil and China, but maybe also globally?
Mm-hmm. There was one huge impact even before the visit. I mean, the preparation of, during the transitional government, Lula's administration set up working groups.
You mean transitional from Bolsonaro to...
From Bolsonaro
which
to
is
Lula's.
Not a triviality.
Absolutely, absolutely. Many challenges, and we knew that things would change in a very consistent way. And so we were part of this working group. Lula's administration is known by engaging with social organizations and civil society organizations more than the previous government of Bolsonaro. And so it was important at this particular moment for us to already put our insights into how would be the directions of Brazil relations toward China. It had to be renewed. And so we had a chance to prepare with other colleagues from other civil society organizations, some guidelines that were actually put into practice once Lula came to China. And remembering funds that were set up by 2013, it was forgotten during a long time, and now they're putting into highlight again because we basically remembered them, that this fund existed. And so it was this impact in our specific think tank and relations between Brazil and China was stronger during this visit because it consolidates everything that we were expecting in this third term of Lula's government. In terms of global perspective, at least for Brazil, it is a new level for Brazil to engage in multiplicity of themes, international themes that obviously during Bolsonaro administration we had to retrieve, including the Paris Agreement and including many other multilateral organizations. So there is a huge... It was a turning point, Lula's visit to China, to set up political intentions and how would be these particular strategic partnerships for Brazil in this new momentum.
Is there any situation where there came in this process of preparing and covering Lula's visit to China, was there any moment where European perspectives came in? Were there any alliances or partnerships with European think tanks or with European perspectives who wanted to work with you at that point?
Not particularly. I do believe that now, and obviously informed by the current war, Ukraine and Russia, the level of relation that Brazil has now with Europe is firstly to the economic side. And so one of the priorities for Lula's government, it is trying to consolidate and establish the partnership Mercosur and European Union. And that's still ongoing. And so there are many levels of debates related to the specificities of this agreement. Most importantly, when we deal with deforestation and how are the levels of debates. I mean, there are intentions of the two parts, but when we come to the particularities, Brazilian analysts do think that is sort of one in harsh demands from European Union. In the levels of exchange, it would be not equalized demands. And obviously, the European Union parts do think that Brazil is not doing necessarily enough in terms of the regulations within to catch up in the level that they expect. So this is still ongoing. But if I could wrap up the relation, this triangular relation, Brazil, China, and European Union, particularly Germany, it would be on the sphere and sector of industry. I mean, that's particularly interesting to Brazil because the intention is to reindustrialize Brazil. We lost many of our industries during this last decade. And it was emphasized the exports of commodities, which in itself is not a bad thing, but it cannot be only that. And so this triangle relationship will focus on, as for example, digitalization of industrial process as much as agribusiness. So there's this intention of Brazil, and firstly, in terms of politics, setting up a peaceful environment so we could keep the production chains and supply chains ongoing. In the second level, receive the know-how of countries such as China and Germany to know how not to lose in terms of industry levels, even though we could export still commodities. And so there is this exchange and learning process that Brazil expects to do.
So when you're talking about a win-win situation, win-win is the big promise of the Belt and Road Initiative. Right? Why has Brazil not, Brazil, especially as a BRICS member state, why has Brazil not joined or not formally signed the BRICS? Why hasn't it the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, that's a question that I've been answering a lot on mainstream media in Brazil. I believe that according to what I listen from most analysts in Brazil, it is that we receive flows of investment from China, yes or yes, even though we don't sign for the Belt and Road Initiative.
So there's no added benefit. No, there's no added benefit.
It's still, even if there is a benefit, it's still not enough to properly match in terms of policies. And we're talking about policies, the investment level is important one because we do have to set up a strategy so the investment flow wouldn't go only for the commodities or infrastructure for exports of commodities that would have, as an example, the backlash in terms of environmental impact in Brazil. And that's something that's obviously quite important since Brazil is trying to leverage this specific issue in international level, being possibly the green power. And so that's in the balance. I mean, we are receiving investment flows from China. They are being diversified, which is also one strategy intention of Brazil, not only receive to raw material and exports of this raw material, but also flows into technology areas and exchange, for example, and communication and automobile sectors. So this is still going on. I do believe that the administration of Brazil government is still don't find it quite profitable to sign in terms of using that still as the leverage to improve also its relation with the United States, for instance.
So you don't have to buy into this narrative of decoupling, or now it's dimmed down to de-risking. That is the European jargon now. So you're saying that you don't need to use such a narrative in order to, emphasize your independence.
Yeah, exactly. I still feel that, historically, diplomacy in Brazil pledges for autonomy through diversity. That's particular concepts that we've been building in Brazilian diplomatic lexicon. And so they're trying to bring it back in a clear contrast of what it was, Bolsonaro's anti-globalism sort of foreign policy. So in the first level, it is to generate political capital domestically and making the spheres, industrial ones, and the agribusiness to understand that that's a new momentum. Understanding that Brazil is, let's say, quote unquote, up to game in the international level and willing to establish and consolidate the previous partnerships. But still being autonomous on its understanding of the game. I mean, Brazilian diplomacy is trying not to fall into this duplicity of choosing sides. So that's historically driven. And I do believe that is strategic for Brazil at a certain point. Brazil already did that during the Second World War, and it worked.
Oh, I see. Well, this is interesting to go back in history for references of a certain policy tradition, because people in Europe, like myself, have very little idea about Brazil as a perspective on the world, not as something down there that Humboldt were describing centuries ago. We've just mentioned the BRICS very briefly. Can you say something about the potential of that group? It's just a kind of group, right? It's not really a formally strong alliance, but it's an opportunity, a facilitator for all kinds of engagement and interaction. So how does that play out for the Brazilian-Chinese relations? And is there anything that Europe could learn from your experience, how to do it right or wrong?
Well, the BRICS was lost momentum, I would say, in the last 7 to 10 years and is gaining momentum again, mostly because it represents this other possibility of global South engaging in strategic partnerships that wouldn't pass necessarily through Bretton Woods institutions. And so it is more pragmatic way of seeing the international system. I would say that within BRICS now, and now we're having as the presidency of Brazilian former President Dilma Rousseff, which is working now in Shanghai. So it's a Brazilian presidency right now within the new development bank. And I do think that that's the forefront in this relationship. It is the possibility of bringing a parallel, I wouldn't say substituting or revise, but a parallel structure of financial system and financial help within groups of the global South, without being necessarily, or without having to catch up in terms of political bureaucracy or changing domestic specificities to attend the loan flow that was what previously come from the Bretton Woods systems, such as the World Bank. That is more pragmatic in a sense that is intentionally not made, and most of it is informed by Chinese foreign policy, not made to interfere in domestic spheres. And so for these countries, it is something that would catalyze investments in development. And the country has the autonomy to target specific areas that is from their interest without having to establish this parallel in terms of political guidance, for instance, cutting budget from governmental expenditure.
So am I understanding you right? You're using your words very carefully, I think, to describe the difference between the Bretton Woods system and the emerging, we could say that, new World Bank or BRICS supported pragmatic system, as you say. Can one say that this opens not only a different system approach, but also has an entirely different culture in its self-understanding in the way that it is emphasizing creating opportunities instead by diversification of opportunities. Would that be the kind of formula instead of competition, hostility, and protectionism, and perhaps colonialism, which has been the charge against the Bretton Woods system for many. Well, since the beginning, actually. So would you say that is a fair summary, kind of motto to say it's diversification as an opportunity strategy?
I do see so. Yeah, I do see so, because it's a part of, from my perspective, more comprehensive movement of understanding that there's not only one way to go in terms of giving people from global south access to development. There's not one single way to do it or one single path to receive loans or to invest on their the sectors that this country see as a gap or lacking investment. I mean, there are many challenges, obviously, and one of them is that New Development Bank or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, they mostly are informed by Asian way of doing things. And that's a challenge for other countries in the global south, where specifically they lack education to catch up this even cultural understanding of how things are done, or how it is the flow of information or bureaucratic procedures, how, let's say, in another level, how the element of trust, it is embedded on this kind of negotiation. So it is one emerging opportunity to diversify the view of how we can access development. But at the same time, there's all these challenges of understanding a brand new process or a brand new way of engaging with other countries.
I find it fascinating that you use the term trust here. And of course, trust is something you can't buy on demand. You have to earn it, and you have to invest in the process of building trust. When I'm using this kind of narrative in Europe, I'm usually accused of being naive, right? And they say, well, what you claim is the kind of Asian or Chinese way or pragmatic approach is rather selling the stick as a carrot. So it's a way of cheating. And I always have the feeling that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if you don't really subscribe to this binary view, but if you have this quality view, which I find in all philosophies, not only in East Asian philosophies, but if you look at Kant's Perpetual Peace, for example, there is this notion that it's reasonable to assume that there cannot be only competition and hostility, but there must be what we say, a teleology kind of approach that is optimistic in a way, saying, well, it's doable. And if we're citizens of the world, then we have to invest this kind of trust that you just mentioned. Now, when you hear this, how does it sound to you from a Brazilian perspective, considering what you see in real China? We know China is also understanding about cynicism and about their own interests and all these more pragmatic things in the more sober-minded sense. So they have an understanding of that. But how do you still think that this can be a fair description to say that this is a kind of win-win-win oriented quality generating, maybe optimistic, not approach, but a chance for such an approach to emerge? What do you think about that?
I do believe it's difficult for whoever didn't have one personal experience in China to fully grasp what we are talking about when we set up the concept of trust, because even in cognitive terms, trust can be seen differently from whatever part of the world you're looking at it. The element of trust in Brazil historically would mean something else than the trust that for me is very pragmatic here. It serves for a purpose. It is within bureaucratic process, is within interpersonal relation, and you can see that once you are embedded in this society, and you see that actually works if you follow the flow. And the element of trust, it goes for example, if you're signing a contract, and the contract is not detailed in terms of description of what's going to happen, or it lacks clarity. So that's exactly specifically when it enters the trust issue. The trust not only for you to ask more detailed explanation, and therefore it is going to be an oral explanation. It's not going to be added specifically in a written way, but it's when you have to trust that the process is going to achieve its goal, not sometimes in the way you expect it to be, but everything can be adjusted. So when we are in China is when we realize how you have to learn their process of learning by doing, or things can be adjusted. And the most important part of it is the process itself, even though there is a goal, but the process will reconfigure and will mold according to circumstances and contexts. And that cannot be done without trust between elements.
And if you put it like that, then it also becomes very obvious why the factor of personal knowledge and personal experience is so important. We cannot just make this a kind of abstract sort of a recipe for building trust, because we have to not just abstractly believe that this is, or on good faith just to accept, but then we would not even understand how these operations really work, because they are involving a lot of knowledge about the other side, and a lot of implicit knowledge, and the way to deal with implicit knowledge, and also the way to manage expectations toward future developments. That is, when you expect that some things will happen within a certain range of scenarios, nobody's suddenly going to change the rules of the game, but they can play the game in a different way. I think this is what you're saying, right?
Absolutely.
So when we have to have confidence that there will be nobody just turning the table, but they will continue to play the game, even if you can't predict the exact pattern of the development of the next moves, right? But this requires a lot of knowledge. And where does this knowledge come from? Well, how about Brazil? Where does knowledge about, real interactions with Chinese come from? Is there even this kind of focus or the expectation that it's worthwhile looking at this level of personal interaction in this sense?
That's a particular problem for Brazil, that because Brazilians don't actually trust others. There was one research made a couple of years ago that measures this sort of trust within population, trust in co-workers, trust in family. And the greatest part of Brazilian, they don't trust others. And so when you come back from China saying that one of the specific elements important in terms of a strategic partnership as much as interpersonal relation, one of the most important elements, it is trust. They don't trust you. And so it seemed like you're lying, and obviously because of polarization in Brazil, they set up you on one side of the game, which is defending autocracies. And so you were sold to Chinese government to make up our minds, and you're becoming also part of this authoritarian mainstream in China because you were there, and somehow they make up your mind to defend them. So it's really difficult to establish one common ground of discussion, much because of the lack of knowledge. And so it's a real difficult barrier to transpass in Brazil. That's obviously one of the main reasons why I decided to join the think tank, in the first place. It is because I felt that in Brazil, because of lack of education, we don't actually pay attention. Let's suppose that China was a real competitor to Brazil, not one partner. To do comparison, still you would have to know about it. And in Brazil, we have this main idea that if you don't like a country, you don't actually have to know anything about it. And that's a huge mistake, because everyone is blind, even to know what's going on.
Well, this is actually the credo of the Enlightenment, is to depart from one's self-induced immaturity. And what you described just is a paraphrase of a self-induced immaturity, because people decide not to want to know based on the assumptions of their established heuristics that they already know what they need to know.
Absolutely.
But this can only work under historical and social circumstances where this isn't backfiring. And now we have the global dynamics, and everybody sees that they are either the victims or at least citizens in that world who can make a little bit of a difference for themselves. But then investment in knowledge and real experience is the starting point on the social scale. Well, I think this is a very interesting train of thought, but I would like to ask you more specifically about how you see Europe now in this constellation. Many of the things you say about Brazil sound quite familiar, but Europe, in another sense, is much more diverse, and it's also much more dynamic. East, west, north, south. Movement of people and ideas has been the recipe for European development for several centuries, and Brazil has a huge internal diversity, but it's obviously also shaped by being surrounded by oceans, and then that's it. You need ships to have real globalization. And in Europe, we had a kind of, like in China, in the times of antiquity, we had this continued force to interact with dynamics of all sorts and make sense of that. So now I think that Europe is not really continuing this kind of tradition of, learning from diversity, but rather taking what you just explained as the Brazilian attitude. But maybe you see Europe in a very different way. How do you look at Europe when you see what our policymakers are doing, and when you see how they appear to perform here in China, when you see European players at work?
From what we've been discussing in Brazil, and that's an interesting question for this point in specific. I just recorded for Brazilian audience 2 episodes of podcasts exactly trying to analyze the relations European Union and European countries toward China.
Please send me the link. We will put it on our website.
Oh, absolutely. It's an interesting turning point for every region in the world. I mean, we are all of us trying to make sense of this transitional moment where we had certain Western perspective and Western assumptions of the world, including theories, by instance, theories of international relations. And now we have to move on these perspectives. And we are still on this process. And for us, in Brazil, the way we see it, it is Europe always also trying to catch up with these new ideas of how the pivot is not the Atlantic anymore. It is Pacific and China, and all these partnerships, they have to be somehow transformed into a new thing, in a more qualitative sort of relation. But at the same time, there is this tension and struggle with the Cold War mentality, as Chinese used to say. There's still one very, let's say, recent memory of the Cold War that didn't abandon us as an international system yet. But we can see this transition where we would have to adapt to a non-Western mode of living, non-Western cultural influence, non-Western cognitive understanding of interpersonal relation. And from a Brazilian perspective, we see Europe also struggling with this momentum. I mean, it seems for instance, the researchers that I've been interviewing myself for the podcast, that there is also this division in European perspective, being East Europe worried with these geopolitical and geostrategic issues because obviously of their proximity of the war, and West Europe still trying to hold on the supply chain and worried with food security, and so is still with strong relations with China, for instance, and obviously with Russia in a certain sense, for raw material. And so there is this struggle to set up one unified voice on how to deal with Russia and China. But from our perspective, and what Brazilian researchers are saying, is that Russia is also different from China. And so they're trying to push, or we see somehow some of the countries or some of the instances mimetizing North American narrative toward China, when they should be focusing on one strategy for Russia and the war and another one for China. And so there is this tension, and from our perspective, we're seeing this tension also unfold.
Wow, this is a very clear insight into the complexity of the new global views, I think. And there's a lot, not really to be learned about it, but for doing this work together. I think this is a very important thing. Now, is there anything you would like to say what you could expect from Europe if you really make Europe very strong in your mind? What do you expect from Europe as a global force? I mean, just talking about the responsibility. Europe has global responsibility. And some people in Europe are very critical about our performance right now in terms of responsibility, because we say we're living in the echo chamber and we're not really paying attention to the needs of the world, which in the end align with our own needs of the future. But we only focus on patterns that have been defined in the past. So when you just reverse this perspective and say, well, Europe has its strengths, Europe has its power, Europe has its own way towards its future. What could that be in terms of relationship with the rest of the world, especially Brazil and China? I know it's a very big question.
Yeah, a lot comes up to my mind now. I will try to summarize, but the first thing I would say, it is a process that is already coming to set, that it is understanding that the world is not this unified, or as Francis Fukuyama would say, the end of history. I mean, all these waves of globalization, and that globalization would solve all the problems, including global South countries' problems, just didn't happen. And so one of the first thing I would say is not mimetizing United States trying to grab still the hegemonical power, not mimetize the narrative, because just it doesn't fit anymore in practical ways. I mean, in most of the countries of the global South, they're worried not with the narrative, they are worried with practical issues that people need to eat. People need to come up with very creative ways to overcome, let's say, environmental impacts. I mean, most of poor people in Brazil, by instance, they suffer with environmental and with climate change. If we had a flood, obviously the most affected people would be the poor ones who doesn't have where to go after that. And so we are worried as global South in a whole with the very practical issues, how to have access to electricity. I mean, you cannot talk about digitalization and we cannot talk about technological advance if when you are in a country that 40% of population doesn't have access to electricity. And so there are previous elements that Global South is trying to put on the table for articulation rather than the narrative. The narrative of democracy versus autocracy just doesn't make sense for the Global South. I mean, a person who lives in Rio de Janeiro favela doesn't talk about democracy versus autocracy. I mean, autocracy makes no sense in terms of lexicon of that place.
So you say even if this person lives in the democracy and can say whatever he likes to say, you would say that this makes no sense to me. Just help me to lead a decent life.
In basic terms, I need to eat to be able even to exercise my political rights. So they're beginning to understand that social rights and civil rights would come possibly with much more immediate importance and impact than the political rights, even though it's equally important, obviously, in terms of voice and expression. But that somehow, at least for Brazil, it's a given thing. Maybe not now, after Bolsonaro's government, but until there, it was a given instance, freedom of expression and all of this. And so I would say that these mimetizing narratives of the good versus the bad doesn't work anymore. And so we'd have to abandon that in the name of something that would fit for a more diverse international system. And the Global South is trying to put that on the table. Look, if you want us to somehow participate in terms of production chains, then we would have to be listened. And that's happening in international organizations, let's say United Nations, Security Council. There is this struggle for a greater voice of these countries to turn the whole articulation in a more pragmatic way, not just in terms of narratives and ideology or ideas, but in through development and through access, then we can have these sort of arguments. And for Europe, it's also valid, this message. Let's say we are obviously worried with establishment of a peaceful international environment, but how we are going to do that is not in terms of narrative, is not in terms of posing 2 or 3 countries as the bad ones of the narrative, that we're going to actually make it happen.
So not talk in terms of some people's dreams, but everybody's reality. Could we put it like that?
That's a good sentence to summarize it.
Can you, just talking about reducing the complexity. At the end, I would like to ask you, after we have talked about these things in all the levels of complexity and the dynamics and the cultural diversity, talking about diversity as an opportunity for development, also for justice. So we didn't really talk very much about the soft power issues, but in between the lines, it's very obvious that for what you have explained, it's absolutely vital to develop the soft power skills that are now also on the table politically, and there's a political agenda here in China. So all these very complex and detailed matters, just forget about them. What do you think when you say, I have a wish to Europe? Mm-hmm. Because our European listeners will want to know, well, what can they take home? And maybe when they go to bed at night, they can think about, well, there was this wish that I received from this scholar from Brazil who lives in China. And can you say that wish to this European citizen in your Brazilian Portuguese, because you're speaking your own Brazilian Portuguese, you're not speaking the European Portuguese language. Should have emphasized that as well. So do you have such a wish? Hopefully you have still wishes and you're not totally
pessimistic level. I'm still optimistic person.
Good, very good. So can you say something like along these lines and just speak in Portuguese? You don't have to translate them.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. O meu desejo é que os países europeus considerem, como nós discutimos aqui hoje, a diversidade como um ponto de aprendizado, né? O aprendizado, ele não é unilateral, unidirecional. É um aprendizado mútuo e de que ainda haja espaço para um otimismo, apesar do cenário tão difícil que está ocorrendo. Eu acredito que esse aprendizado, ele deve ser, em primeira instância, a nível pessoal, a nível de entendimento, depois a nível interpessoal, né, o respeito à diversidade do outro. Nós vemos que essa é uma fricção na Europa muito por causa de processos migratórios e difíceis, eu entendo, mas é somente a partir desse entendimento da diversidade e de criar habilidades na comunicação interpessoal e na comunicação entre culturas e entre linguagens, estabelecendo um chão comum para essas culturas, é que a gente pode encontrar os elementos de cooperação.
Thank you very much. I think this, I can't speak Portuguese, but I can hear the European roots of your language, which have a lot to do with Latin, obviously. Mm-hmm. So it was wonderful to talk with you, and I just wish you and your think tank and your career and your personal life in China great success, and hope we can continue to work together. Thank you very much, Dr. Tedeschi.
Absolutely. It was great to be here. I'm very thankful for this brief. We could talk hours along, but it's really fulfilling even to discuss these main issues, passing through different levels of the concrete level to the more emotional level and learning process. I'm very glad with this conversation.
Global citizenship is a holistic thing, right? Thank you very much.
I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
Iam europeană.
Európai polgár vagyok.
Eu sou europeia.
Jag är en medborgare i Europa.
Ja sam europeanka.
Yo soy ciudadana del continente europeo.
Jestem europejczykiem.
Esu europiete. Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja gaștancă Европы.
Я громадянка Європи. Esu europiete.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.